first of our main stories is concerning the birth rate crisis. An economic trend or a moral shift is the question. And the recent reports highlight a growing global trend where deaths are beginning to outnumber births in several countries. Falling birth rates, aging populations, and changing social priorities are raising concerns about economic sustainability, shrinking workforces, and increasing pressure on healthcare systems. While governments are introducing financial incentives and policy reforms, experts warn that these measures may not address the deeper cultural and societal shifts behind declining family formation. We hope to be speaking to Dr. Bernice Kuang shortly. And Bernice Kuang is a family and fertility researcher at the University of Southampton on the Generations and Gender Study Project, studying families in the UK and in comparison with countries across Europe. She completed her PhD in social statistics and demography at the University of Southampton and a master's in public health with a concentration in demography at Johns Hopkins University. She has worked on various USAID and privately funded population health projects as a technical advisor in reproductive health. Bernice's main research areas are fertility, partnership formation, and dissolution and family planning. So we hope we will be speaking to her soon. And while we're waiting, I will ask or draw on Imam Shazib's wealth of knowledge and give us some kind of an Islamic perspective on this issue.
Before Islamic perspective, let's talk about it generally, that across many parts of the world today, one major demographic change is beginning to concern economics, governments, healthcare system, and sociologists alike, and that is the sharp decline in birth rates. So for centuries, population generally grew steadily. Improvements in healthcare and sanitation and nutrition increased life expectancy. But we have our first guest with us.
Right. We have Dr. Bernice Kuang with us. Thank you very much for joining us on the Breakfast Show, Dr. Kuang.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me.
Good morning. Right. So we're discussing this issue about the birth rate crisis. They're declining across many countries. What do you think, what do you believe are the biggest factors that is causing this drive?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me on today. And, it's a question that has generated a lot of interest. But I think the first thing we should keep in mind is that fertility is declining right now, in part because of postponement of first births. So the Economic and Social Research Council has funded a lot of really great high-quality research studying these patterns on a large population scale. So without, looking at actual data, like registered birth data and census data. And we found that what is driving fertility decline in recent years has been the decline of that first birth. So once people do have children, they still go on to have 2 or 3 or 4 children. But it's that first birth that people have been putting off. So this is a social pattern that could change in the future. So it could be that we're seeing decline now because young people are just waiting longer before they start having their families. And we may see a bit of a rebound later when, now it's perfectly normal to have your first birth when you're 30 and then, have more after. Whereas previously people may have started in their 20s. But we also do know that this decline in fertility can sometimes be linked to apprehension about the future, economic security. And when we look at fertility intentions specifically using population level survey data, younger people do seem to be saying that they have lower fertility intentions than previous cohorts of young people. And this could be a preference or, social acceptance of it. Maybe it's okay to say now, oh no, I'm not interested in having children. So on the one hand, it's postponement that is maybe masking long-term patterns, making fertility look a lot lower than it actually will be once people are done having, at the end of their reproductive years. And then on the other hand, we do find that lower fertility intentions are often associated with economic anxiousness or insecurity.
Oh, so you think there's an economic pressure that's involved? People are delaying having children because they do not feel that they're economically secure.
Yeah, there has been a lot of recent research across Europe, actually, that goes beyond kind of traditional standard economic measures like employment or education level. And they found that even people who have jobs and have degrees, they still have this kind of anxiousness about the future and uncertainty about what the future could hold. So we found that it's more, there's more to it than just, okay, if you have a job, then you're economically secure. Because the cost of housing is so high. The UK is unique for having extremely high cost of childcare. And, many families, both parents have to work economically. They wouldn't be able to get by without it. So formal childcare is really important. Economic security is something that's touched on again and again and again in research across the Western world, and it's linked to lower fertility intentions.
You also indicated in your answer that this is not something that's permanent. This is perhaps going to be reversible. What makes you feel that?
Yeah, well, because the way we measure fertility, it's year on year. But if a whole birth cohort of people, like, young people born in the 90s or born in 2005, if they're all deciding, okay, well, instead of having children at 30, we're going to have children at 35. Then, and, I talked to my undergrads who I teach at a university, and I asked them, do you guys think 30 is old to start a family or to have your first kid? And they're like, no, that's dead average. Like, that's not old at all. So just norms about when is a good time to start a family is just older. So that affects the year-on-year pattern. But if you ask these kids, when they're 50, well, how many kids have you had? It still might be 2 or 3, because people's ideal, like, fertility preferences, like survey data tells us that people still value having children, and people still really idealize 2-child, 3-child families. Like, that's still what people think is like, what they aspire to.
Can you point out some of the long-term consequences of declining birth rates and aging populations for healthcare systems, economies, and the wider society?
Well, in the short term, I've already talked to people across organizations about school closures, maternity care, volume change, businesses that serve children and young families, like soft play centers and play cafes. They've had struggled or had to close or gone out of business. The shape of the population was very different. I've gone to events in London where people, policymakers in London are specifically concerned about London looking like a city that doesn't have families, that doesn't have children. But like a population with very few young people and children is a very different kind of population than one that's more balanced. So this, in the very short term, things like this have been happening already. And in the longer run, there'll be fewer working age people. Funding Social Security will need to be reevaluated. It would probably be a good idea to figure out how to support people to work into older ages, since Social Security, could be affected and people may have to figure out how to support themselves a little longer. But all this, talk about, fertility decline is going to lead to population extinction. It will take decades before the population actually declines. So while the shape of the population is changing, there's plenty of reforms and changes that can be made now to address these. Like, it's a slow moving process. And I feel like there's a lot of talk about the panic around it, and less focus on the unexciting small policy changes that could be implemented to help in the meantime. Like, for example, China has had very low fertility for decades, like since the 70s, but only now is population starting to decline in China. So there is a lot of time to kind of figure out and kind of radically rethink what to do beyond, but beyond complaining that young people don't want to have children. When they do, actually, if you ask about their ideals, they'll say, yeah, a 2-child family is ideal.
Thank you. My colleague also has some questions. Before he asks his questions, you mentioned China. I've always been intrigued about its one-child policy. What has been the impact of that policy on the nation?
There's been a lot of, I think, inadvertent impacts of the policy. Population aging is a major issue, but it's not just in China. China was the only country that implemented that specific family planning policy, but across East Asia, fertility is very low. And those other countries like South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, they all have very low fertility, but none of them had that family planning policy. So impacts are like population aging, where there was very rigid preference for sons, then there was a skewed sex ratio of men to women, and now in some in some subgroups of the population, there's a lot more men than women, and because of some very strong norms about you have to get married, you have to have children. It's a very prescribed social pattern. This has made it difficult for some people to follow that social pattern.
Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Bernice. You compare family trends in the UK with countries across Europe. Are there any countries responding more successfully to falling birth rates? And what can Britain learn from them?
Right now, not really. So historically, countries, we've always looked at countries in Scandinavia, like Norway, Finland, Sweden, as being more supportive of families because their gender equality is higher, because they really support the reconciling of work and childcare for both men and women. So that has made it possible for young families to both continue on, working and living, but also having children. And historically, they have had higher fertility rates. But even now, those countries are also seeing similar patterns of fertility decline, and kind of linked to the same things, like this non-specific notion of uncertainty and anxiousness about the future. So right now, in countries that we would typically regard as quote unquote successful in supporting families are also seeing similar patterns. It's a variety of countries in which this has happened. We do know that in Scandinavian countries, not in the UK yet, but in like Finland, for example, fertility decline is starting to change because it used to be that the least educated people had the most children, and now that's flipping around, and it's the most educated people who are the most likely to have kids. So that tells us, this social pattern is telling us that supporting people who are disadvantaged, who don't have as many resources, could help to support families.
So beyond economics and policy, do you think declining birth rates also reflect a deeper cultural or a social shift in how modern societies view family life and parenthood?
I think it's really possible that in order to really know, we have to ask young people. I'm not young anymore, so I can't speculate. But these questions about a cultural shift about parenthood, they're something that we really need to specifically ask people. So we can look at, with large scale data, we can see what the social patterns of fertility decline are, like, and what groups is this happening in? Is it the first birth, the second birth, or the third birth? But to really get at things like values, we really need to ask people. So far, our survey data that does have some values questions still shows that people still do value children and they idealize 2-child families. But what they think about how that fits into their other goals, or when they would like to do that, or how ideal in reality, there's a gap. Those more nuanced questions really requires more research, and it really requires us talking more in depth to young people.
So is there also a growing fear of losing personal freedom or career opportunities when becoming a parent, especially among younger professionals?
I mean, they're very well maybe, and we can speculate because it makes sense. It's not easy in the modern world. Like modern parenthood is not easy with all of its demands. But we really have to ask people to know. So we do know over time that people both spend more hours in work and spend more hours in childcare, and that time has to come somewhere. So that usually comes out of leisure. Whether this is now putting people off having children, we can't know that, one A causes B, but we do know that parenting is a more intensive task than it used to be, that even women who work spend more time in childcare than women who did not work in the past. So over time, women now work more minutes, more hours. We know that from time use data across countries, but we also know that somehow they're also finding time to do more childcare, and the time that men spend doing childcare, not everywhere, but in some countries, is also increasing in minutes.
So some countries have introduced financial incentives and family support policies to encourage higher birth rates. Based on your research, how effective are these measures in practice?
They're not really effective. Overall, quite a bit of research has really tried to figure out which policies actually, encourage people to have more children, or which policies are linked to an increase in birth rate. And the evidence is very, very weak and very, very shaky. Number one, it's very hard to prove that a policy causes anything, because sometimes changes happen regardless of what the policy is. So that's hard. It's hard to find like a good context where you need like almost like a national or natural experiment. And if there was something that consistently worked, everyone would be doing it, but we haven't found that. We know that sometimes things can cause, like a policy can cause a short-term impact. For example, like if someone is planning to have 2 children anyway, a policy implemented in 1 year might encourage them to have their second kid sooner rather than later. But at the end of the day, they still have had the 2 children that they always planned on having. They just had the second one a little sooner. So that, that's not really a major long-term change. It's a matter of timing, right? Which can make the year-on-year measurements look different. But the timing of your children and the number of your children, most people, when they think about declining fertility, they're not concerned about timing. They're concerned about the overall number at the end of the day, when all is said and done, how big is the family ended up having. So there's very few policies that seem to be linked to higher fertility or to raising fertility. The evidence that does exist suggests that longer term policies that help people reconcile work and family, so childcare, maternity leave, parental leave, paternity leave, all of that starts from when children are born and then continues throughout like working life. That the most expensive, complicated policy there is does seem to have some kind of relationship with fertility, and that short-term things like cash incentives are really much less demonstrative in their success.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bernice, for joining us today and for sharing your insight on such an important and complex issue. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.